I do not care about your precious memories of my father. This trash goes to auction, and you go to the street. Two greedy stepsons hired investigators and forged their late father's signature to evict his widow into the freezing Vermont winter. Their sheer cruelty was sickening, but Helen refused to surrender her shop. While conducting a careful inspection of her ransacked archive room, she discovered a faded relic from the family's past. This unexpected item, examined under an ultraviolet light in court, exposed a betrayal so dark the judge immediately ordered a criminal investigation. The scalpel in my hand scraped the dry spine with microscopic precision. Flakes of ancient animal glue fell onto the dark oak workbench, joining the silent drifts of cedar shavings. A copy of Robert Frost's New Hampshire, published in 1923, required delicate handling. My late husband Arthur placed this volume in my hands decades ago during our first autumn. Sweet, musty scent of decomposing paper rose from the open pages, mingling with the rich aroma of melted beeswax heating nearby. Outside, Vermont winter asserted its grip, throwing heavy snow. Ancient pine floorboards of my shop, Legacy, groaned softly under the weight of the wind. I worked with slow, methodical strokes, finding comfort in the quiet, rhythmic scrape of metal. I rested my glasses on their silver chain, leaning closer to inspect the split joints. Turning a fragile leaf, my fingers brushed against a pencil inscription hidden on the rear end paper. Handwriting. The graphite marks pressed gently into the heavy, rag-weave sheet, creating microscopic troughs my skin recognized instantly. For my Helen, whose hands heal paper, heart heals me. A quiet ache bloomed in my chest. I traced the faded curves, inhaling the scent of iron gall ink and centuries-old dust trapped within the binding. The grandfather clock in the corner chimed, its brass pendulum swinging with comforting regularity. Suddenly, the brass bell above the front door shrieked. A gust of icy mountain air swept inside, instantly carrying away the warm aroma of beeswax and old paper. The temperature in the shop plummeted in seconds, freezing the fine moisture. Rubber-soled boots stomped onto the hand-woven rug, grinding gray slush and road salt into the wood. The intruder stood in the entryway, a hulking silhouette against the white storm. Vance. The private investigator hired by my stepsons, Charles and Richard. He shook his damp, synthetic parka, sending freezing water droplets onto a nearby display of rare, leather-bound memoirs. A wave of harsh, chemical cologne and wet dog wool overpowered the subtle scents of my shop. He marched toward my workbench, his boots squeaking rhythmically on the dry pine boards. Speaking, he retrieved a thick plastic folder from his pocket and slapped it onto the polished oak counter. The impact sounded like a pistol shot in the quiet room there, chest heaving, his eyes scanning the quiet sanctuary with a hunter's calculation. "Your bank accounts are frozen as of 3 o'clock, Mrs. Vance," he said, his voice a gravelly rasp. "The asset is locked. The entire collection in this building is under legal attachment." He strolled past the counter, his eyes scanning the shelves with obvious greed. A gloved hand reached out, grabbing a rare 1845 edition of Edgar Allan Poe's The Raven and Other Poems. My chest tightened. He squeezed the fragile green cloth binding, his thick fingers leaving damp stains on the delicate cover. A sickening dry crunch echoed through the aisle, the sound of brittle paper fibers fracturing under brute force. My hands went ice cold. Out from behind my workbench, my movements deliberate, my voice dropping to a low, quiet whisper. "Remove your hands from this volume." I stood tall, my spine rigid, to show the tremor attempting to seize my limbs. Vance smirked, tightening his grip on the Poe. I lunged forward, my fingers wrapping around his thick wrist. The synthetic fabric of his sleeve scraped against my palms. We struggled in the narrow aisle, our boots scraping the dry floorboards. The oak shelves creaked alarmingly to dump centuries of history onto the floor. With a sudden twist of my body, I wrenched the precious book from his grasp, pressing the cool leather against my ribs. Stepped forward, his face darkening with anger. My hand dropped to the nearest flat surface, brushing against a heavy, cold object. The 19th century cast-iron book press, rusty screw thread loomed next to me, smelling of ancient machine oil and iron. I gripped the heavy metal handle, the cold iron biting into my palm. I lifted the heavy iron press, slammed it onto the oak counter with furious force. The metallic clang vibrated through the floorboards, rattling the glass panes of the display cabinets. Out of fine gray dust exploded from the crevices of the wood, catching the faint light. Vance froze, his hand hovering inches from my shoulder. The sheer weight of the iron spoke than any shout. We stared at each other through the swirling dust. Slowly, he lowered his hand, his eyes widening slightly as he registered the determination in my stance. "Not over, Helen," he muttered, turning toward the exit. He pushed the heavy door open, the brass bell jingling wildly. The door slammed shut, leaving me alone with the quiet smell of iron and dust. My breath came in shallow, sharp gasps, the silence of the shop returning like a heavy weight. My hands shook as I reached for the heavy black rotary telephone. The light receiver pressed cold against my ear. I dialed, the mechanical whir of the wheel sounding agonizingly slow. Thomas, the local blacksmith, answered on the second ring. I called Sarah at the bakery. 20 minutes later, the front doorbell rang again. This time, my friends entered, bringing the comforting sense of coal smoke, hot metal, and yeast. His thick wool coat smelled of the forge, while Sarah's apron carried a faint dusting of flour. They took one glance at the empty spaces on my shelves and understood. "To move the books," I whispered, my voice raspy. Thomas nodded, his weathered face hardening. "We have the truck outside. The storm will cover our tracks." In silence, retrieving sturdy pine wine crates from the rear storeroom. The wooden boxes smelled of dry pine and cellar dampness. I wrapped each first edition in acid-free tissue paper, soft rustle of the sheets filling the quiet space. My bare skin absorbed the dry, powdery texture of the ancient leather covers. I held a rare edition of Whitman's Leaves of Grass, smelling the sweet, vanilla-like aroma of decaying paper fibers. My fingers memorized the raised bands on the spine before I laid it gently into the nest of tissue. Carried the heavy crates with quiet efficiency, his boots squeaking rhythmically on the floor. With each book packed, the shop grew emptier, a hollow shell of its former warmth, the wood of the shelves reflecting the cold, gray light. We carried the crates through the rear exit, stepping directly into the freezing Vermont blizzard, and screamed through the narrow alley, throwing handfuls of sharp, icy snow into our faces. My wool sweater damped quickly, the wet fibers smelling of lanolin and cold water. The corners of a pine crate, my fingers growing numb against the rough wood. Thomas slung the heavy boxes into the bed of his old Ford pickup, covering them with a thick canvas tarp. We secured the ropes, our knuckles scraping against the frozen metal hooks. The truck engine sputtered to life, releasing a cloud of gray exhaust that mingled with the swirling white snow. The red taillights vanish into the blinding white storm, leaving me alone in the freezing dark, my breath freezing on my eyelashes. I returned inside, locking the heavy oak door. The books, the room appeared vast and sterile. The bare shelves exposed pale lines of wood where the dust had not settled, silent witnesses to the treasures now gone. The remaining scent was the dampness of melted snow on the floorboards. I walked to the center of the room, my footsteps echoing hollowly against the high ceiling. Steps sounded like a dry crack of wood. Suddenly, twin beams of bright halogen headlights cut through the frosted windows, casting long, distorted shadows across the bare walls. The hum of a powerful engine vibrated through the floorboards. My chest tightened. They were here, sooner than I anticipated, their presence heralded by the glare of high beams slicing through. The door opened with a violent gust of wind. Charles entered, his cashmere coat draped perfectly over his broad shoulders, smelling of expensive tobacco and dry cleaning. Behind him came Richard, his eyes darting greedily around the room, and Sheriff Miller, whose wet leather duty belt squeaked loudly with each step. The smell of exhaust fumes and wet wool scanned the empty shelves, a cruel sneer twisting his thin lips. "Hiding assets, Helen?" he drawled, his voice dripping with condescension. A foolish move. Miller stepped forward, his heavy boots leaving dark, wet puddles on the pine floor. He avoided my gaze, his hand resting uncomfortably on his holster, the brass buckles on his uniform. Reached into his leather briefcase, retrieved a crisp document, and handed it to the sheriff. Miller stepped forward, presenting the paper to me. I took the sheet, my fingers immediately recognizing the cheap, smooth texture of modern copy paper, smelling faintly of hot laser toner. My eyes traveled to the bottom of the page. My heart stopped. Written in bold blue ink was Arthur's signature, his distinct, elegant hand. "This is an additional agreement to the company charter," Charles said, stepping closer, his presence suffocating. "The entire collection belongs to the firm. Tell us where the books are, Helen, or the sheriff will arrest you for grand larceny right now." The brass bell above the door jingled softly in the draft. The theater remained dead. Shivering under Arthur's heavy wool shawl, I sat at my workbench, my breath rising in dense white puffs. The frozen pipes clicked in the walls. Charles had frozen my bank accounts. The utility company had cut the heating, leaving the shop to the mercy of the Vermont frost. Condensation crawled down the window panes, freezing. Small, clear patch on the glass, I eyed the dark SUV idling across the street. Robert Vance sat inside, a glowing cigarette tip illuminating his silhouette. The pale aroma of damp pine wood and old paper in the room was heavy, chilled to the core. My fingers, stiff from the cold, traced the outline of the empty shelves. A tap sounded against the rear door. I hurried across the room, the pine floorboards emitting a sharp, frozen groan under my weight. I unlocked the deadbolt, stood on the threshold, her face pale, shivering. The scent of wet snow and cinnamon drifted from her coat. With trembling hands, she thrust a cardboard box into my arms. Inside lay our 1866 edition of Alice in Wonderland. "I cannot keep this, Helen," she whispered, her eyes darting toward the street. "Detective Vance visited my husband at the bakery, threatened a tax audit. He will ruin us." Sarah vanished into the swirling snow before I could speak. I held the volume, inhaling its familiar scent of dry glue and aging paper, sweet trace of vanilla poisoned by the bitter stench of fear. I carried the returned volume to Arthur's private sanctuary in the rear storeroom. My eyes settled on his old mahogany roll-top desk under a thick layer of gray dust. I retrieved his heavy brass keyring from my pocket. The lock turned with a dry, mechanical scrape. Slowly, I lifted the slatted roll-top lid, slats squeaking as they slid into the upper recess. A concentrated wave of memories escaped. The rich, dry aroma of cedar wood, dried iron gall ink, and crumbling red sealing wax remained exactly as he had left it, a frozen fragment of his life. I sat on the cane-bottomed chair, listening to the wind rattle the rafters above. I pulled open the side drawer, fingers sliding over the polished wood. Inside lay a bundle of faded letters, tied together with a fragile, decaying silk ribbon. The ribbon crumbled into black dust under my touch. Letters Arthur had written to Charles during his first years at boarding school, dating back to the mid-'80s. The heavy linen paper rustled softly, releasing a faint scent of lavender. I smoothed the crease of an envelope, tracing the elegant pen strokes of my husband's handwriting. Suddenly, a sharp, distinct creak echoed from the main shop and was inside. My chest tightened. Quickly, I blew out the candle, plunging the rear storeroom into pitch darkness. I pressed my spine against the towering oak bookcase, holding my breath. A beam of light cut through the doorway, dancing across the dust-covered floor. Footsteps approached, heavy and dragging. The scent of wet synthetic fabric and cheap, stale tobacco filled. He had entered through the lock he had broken earlier. He marched straight to Arthur's desk, his flashlight beam illuminating the open drawers. I watched from the shadows as his glove began tearing through the family archives, his fingers scattering sheets of fragile paper with reckless haste. Vance yanked the center drawer, the wood groaning and splintering. Cracks signaled the destruction of a delicate inner partition. My anger flared, overriding my fear. This man was destroying the quiet sanctuary of Arthur's memory. I reached out, my fingers brushing against the cold, heavy bronze bookend shaped like a sleeping lion. The textured metal felt solid, reassuring. I gripped the bronze base, my knuckles turning. Out of the shadow, but my boot caught the edge of a loose floorboard. A sharp squeak shattered the silence. Vance froze, his flashlight beam swinging instantly toward my hiding place, blinding me with its harsh glare. Before he could react, I lunged forward, swinging the heavy bronze lion with entire force. The metal struck his forearm with a dull thud. Vance grunted in pain, flashlight slipping from his hand and clattering onto the pine floorboards. Darkness returned, broken only by the erratic light of the rolling cylinder. He lunged at me, his thick fingers the collar of my sweater and tearing my wool shawl. We grappled in the narrow space, our boots scuffing the wood, knocking over a delicate mahogany pedestal table. The glass inkwell shattered, the dark fluid splashing across the floor, releasing a sharp, chemical scent. I wrenched myself free, gasping for air. Knowing every inch of the floorboards, I sidestepped the fallen table. Vance stumbled in the dark, his boots crunching on the broken glass. I retrieved the rolling flashlight, aiming the beam directly into his eyes. Foiled, cursed, and shielded his face with his leather-gloved hand. "Leave this shop immediately," I commanded, my voice cold, devoid of tremor. He sneered, but the sight, heavy bronze lion still in my grip, made him hesitate. Nursing his bruised arm, he retreated toward the rear exit, his boots dragging. He pushed the door open and vanished into the howling, the door slamming shut behind him. When the latch clicked, I switched on the overhead light, the weak bulb casting a harsh yellow glare over the wreckage. The room was ruined. Glass, black ink, and torn paper littered the floor. I rushed to Arthur's desk, my breath catching in my throat. The secret compartment at the rear of the desk had been pried open. The velvet lining was shredded. The letters Arthur had written to Charles, the childhood correspondence, were entirely gone. Vance had stolen the only proof of Arthur's genuine relationship. Son. I fell to my knees, my fingers touching the torn velvet, my mind racing to understand why Charles wanted those letters destroyed. Unyielding, I returned to my workbench, the copy of the agreement Charles had presented. I pulled my heavy magnifying glass close, illuminating the sheet under the desk lamp. Under magnification, the paper fibers appeared uniform, lacking the irregular cotton and flax inclusions typical of paper from Arthur's era. It was a modern sheet, simulated to appear aged, but created with contemporary cellulose. Without the original document, my observations meant nothing to a judge. I needed the original to prove the forgery, but Charles's lawyers held it tightly. I was trapped, evidence no court would accept. A loud, rhythmic pounding on the front door shattered my thoughts. The brass bell rattled frantically. I walked to the entrance, the cold draft street freezing my ankles. A man in the uniform of the Woodstock court stood on the snow-covered porch, holding a clipboard. He handed me a thick blue envelope, its wax seal bearing county crest. "Sign here," he muttered, his boots leaving dark puddles on my clean floorboards. I took the metal pen, my fingers trembling as I signed the wet receipt, the clipboard, and departed, leaving me alone with the heavy envelope. I broke the brittle wax seal, the red fragments falling like drops of dried blood onto my workbench. Acted the document, the fresh printing ink smelling sharp and synthetic. It was an emergency order for immediate seizure. Charles and Richard had obtained a court warrant to confiscate the entire building and my personal residence to satisfy their claim. The eviction was scheduled for tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. I collapsed into my chair, staring at the empty shelves. Everything I loved, the books, the memories of Arthur, would be stripped away in 12 hours. Early morning found me entering the basement laboratory of Dr. Edward Ashley, expert in paper conservation and a trusted friend of Arthur's. His workshop, hidden under the old Rutland Library, was a sanctuary of the past. The damp air carried a pungent scent, vinegar, pine rosin, and centuries-old dust. Towering stacks of yellowed newspapers and archival boxes formed narrow, labyrinthine corridors. Dr. Ashley, a gentle man in a frayed tweed jacket, me with a soft smile. The wooden floorboards groaned beneath my quick, desperate footsteps. I emptied the fragments of paper I had scraped from the copy onto his walnut table. Dust motes danced in the pale shafts of morning light, and Dr. Ashley's hand reached out with brass tweezers, his touch indicating a silent, shared hope. Ashley placed the paper fibers on the stage of his vintage 1950s Leica microscope. I stood beside him, holding my breath in the dim room, which was illuminated only by the warm glow of the microscope bulb. The air smelled of heated metal and burnt dust. With ink-stained fingers, he slowly turned the brass focus knob. The metallic squeak of the thread sounded like a screech. Silence. He squeezed a tiny drop of chemical reagent from a glass pipette onto the slide. Instantly, a sharp, acidic odor of sulfur and vinegar filled the space. The scientist frowned, his eyes narrowing as he peered through the binocular eyepiece, and my chest tightened, waiting for his analysis. "Helen, examine this," Dr. Ashley whispered, aside. I pressed my eye to the cool metal lens. Under magnification, the paper fibers appeared like massive, woven ropes. He switched on a portable ultraviolet light, emitted a high-pitched hum. Suddenly, the fibers on the screen glowed with a brilliant, fluorescent violet light. "This is OBA-38, a synthetic optical brightening agent," Ashley explained, voice echoing off the brick arches. "This chemical was patented and introduced to commercial paper manufacturing in 2018. Arthur died in 2015. This document is a physical impossibility." A surge of hope cut through my exhaustion, the sharp scent of ozone from the UV lamp smelling like sweet victory. Dr. Ashley moved quickly, packing a compact testing kit into Arthur's old leather. He secured a micro-UV light, chemical reagents, and a brass magnifying loupe inside the compartments. The thick leather of the satchel, worn smooth at the corners, smelled of saddle soap, oil, and old paper. The brass buckle snapped shut with a heavy metallic click. I slung the thick strap over my shoulder, the weight of the bag offering a strange sense of security. "Helen," Ashley warned, guiding me to the exit. "Charles and Richard will stop at nothing to protect their forgery." The floorboards creaked in farewell, and I stepped into the biting of the morning, ready to face the storm. A blinding blizzard whipped my face as I hurried through the streets of Rutland. Seeking a shortcut to the train station, I slipped into a narrow between 19th-century brick warehouses. The towering walls smelled of damp mortar and ancient soot. The frozen snow crunched loudly under my boots. Suddenly, a dark figure stepped, white haze blocking my path. Robert Vance. His face was obscured by his hood, his arm wrapped in a thick white bandage from our night encounter. "Give me the satchel, old woman," he growled, breath smelling of cheap whiskey and damp wool. I gripped the strap of Arthur's leather bag, my heart hammering against my ribs as Vance stepped closer. Vance lunged forward, his gloved fingers clawing at the leather strap. The aged leather creaked under the tension, threatening to snap. I slipped on a patch of black ice, falling hard onto the frozen cobblestones. Slush soaked through my wool coat, but I refused to let go of the satchel. My hand scraped against the brick wall, brushing against a wooden bin filled with rock salt for the winter roads. A handful of the coarse, dirty salt and threw it directly into Vance's eyes. He cried out, recoiling in pain, his hands flying to his face. I scrambled to my feet, gasping for breath, freezing, salt-scented air. Blindly, Vance flailed his arms, trying to grab my coat. I swung the heavy leather satchel, using its weight to strike his face with entire force. The buckle of the bag connected with his cheek with a sickening thud. He collapsed onto the snow-covered pavement, crimson droplets staining the white drifts. I turned and ran toward the train station, my boots slipping on the ice. My chest burned with the freezing air, and the taste of blood was metallic on my lip. I had bitten it during the struggle. The satchel remained safe on my shoulder, and I boarded the train to Woodstock as the doors slid shut. An hour later, I entered the Grand Victorian Courthouse in Woodstock. The oak doors closed behind me. shutting out the howling blizzard. Inside, the grand halls smelled of floor wax, wet wool coats, and ancient legal ledgers. I walked down the marble corridor, steps echoing off the high ceiling. I ignored the dull ache in my bruised knee, keeping my shoulders straight. Inside Courtroom 4, the benches of dark ash wood were already occupied. Concerned locals. Charles and Richard sat confidently at the prosecution table, whispering to their lawyer, Mr. Stern, who was arranging heavy leather-bound dossiers with smug satisfaction. My seat next to my defense attorney, Thomas Blake. He examined my torn sleeve and cut lip with deep concern, but I merely opened Arthur's satchel, retrieving the UV lamp and Dr. Ashley's report. The paper rustled softly, releasing the scent of the basement laboratory into the stuffy room. Across the aisle, Charles adjusted his gold watch, offering me a cold, agonizing smile. Mr. Stern spread his documents on the wooden podium, his movements deliberate and arrogant. The air in the room was thick, smelling of old paper and impending doom. Judge Honorable Harrison called the session to order. Mr. Stern immediately rose, holding a document with a golden notary seal. Your Honor, we submit a notarized affidavit from Clara Gable, personal secretary of the late Arthur Vance for 20 years, Stern announced. My blood ran cold. Stern read her statement aloud. Clara claimed under oath she personally witnessed, signed the supplementary agreement in 2014. The paper of her affidavit, thick, expensive parchment, gleamed under the courtroom lights. Thomas Blake passed the copy to me. The raised, cold notary seal, smelling the fresh ink, realizing Charles had bought Clara's loyalty to seal my ruin. Thomas Blake rose, presenting Dr. Ashley's analysis, chemical marker in the paper. Judge Harrison examined the report but slowly shook his head. Mrs. Vance, this court cannot accept an unofficial chemical analysis conducted on a photocopy, stated, his voice booming in the quiet room. We require the original document for a state-appointed forensic test. Stern immediately interjected, claiming the original agreement, confidential corporate asset, and could not be surrendered to the defense. The judge nodded in agreement. I was trapped. The original paper remained out of reach. Evidence was ruled inadmissible. The court finds no legal barrier to the execution of the seizure warrant, Judge Harrison declared, reaching for his fountain pen. Each of his pen on the paper sounded like a knife slicing through my life. Charles and Richard exchanged triumphant glances, while Richard smirked openly at my defeat, motionless, my fingers clutching the worn leather strap of Arthur's satchel. The smell of ink, old wax, and dusty wood in the courtroom was suffocating. Tomorrow morning, my shop home would be gone, and my husband's legacy would be liquidated. I stared at the judge's desk, my mind reeling in the heavy, hopeless silence. Judge Harrison raised his heavy wooden gavel to seal my eviction. In that critical second, I stood up from the defense table. The ashwood floorboards of the courtroom groaned loudly under my weight, drawing the eyes of every reader. Your Honor, before you sign my ruin, I request one last opportunity, I said, my voice steady, my fingers gripping the cool brass railing of the witness stand. Allow me to examine the original document here, under the court's direct supervision. It will require only 3 minutes. Mr. Stern leaped to his feet, protesting loudly, but Judge Harrison hated. In the quiet room, the heavy tick of the wall clock sounded like a beating heart. The judge gazed at my face, smelled the stale courtroom dust, and slowly lowered his gavel, his permission. I stepped onto the elevated witness platform. My fingers grazed the smooth, hand-rubbed oak railing, which had been polished by decades of nervous hands. I carefully unpacked Dr. Ashley's portable microscope and the small UV lamp from Arthur's leather satchel, arranging them on the wooden ledge. I connected the microscope to the court's system. The cold brass of the antique instrument chilled my palms, and a faint smell of warm copper wiring rose from the lamp, mixing with the sharp scent of floor wax. Under the focus wheel, my hands steady, my mind focused entirely on the task. Across the room, Charles sneered, but his fingers began to twitch against his cashmere coat. The judge ordered Mr. Stern to surrender the original agreement to the court clerk. With obvious reluctance, Stern slid the document across the table. The clerk placed the sheet onto my workbench. Paper snapped against the wood. I took the page, my bare fingertips sensing the cheap, uniform texture of the modern copy paper, which emitted a faint, chemical smell of fresh toner. I did the slide, positioning the signature section directly under the lens. The giant screen on the wall behind the judge flickered to life, projecting a massive, high-definition image. Blue ink strokes. The courtroom held its collective breath. I pressed the switch on my UV lamp. The courtroom dimmed as the violet light flooded the document, casting a fluorescent glow across the witness stand. A faint scent of warm dust rose from the bulb. Under the ultraviolet rays, the paper of the agreement flared with a brilliant, poisonous blue fluorescence. "Observe the glowing blue fibers on the screen, Your Honor," I explained, my voice echoing off the high ceiling. "This is the signature of synthetic optical brighteners, this specific paper, manufactured years after Arthur's passing. This document is a physical impossibility." A murmur of shock rippled through the spectators, and Charles's face grew pale in the violet light. "Further proof," I continued, reaching into Arthur's satchel. My hand brushed past the leather lining, retrieving the yellowed linen postcard from 1985. The card Vance had missed his search. The thick, fibrous cardboard had slightly frayed edges and smelled of dry pulp and faded lavender. I laid it on the stand next to the agreement. "The Christmas postcard Arthur sent to Charles on his 10th birthday," I said, the words falling like lead weights in the silent room. "And this card is the source of the forged signature." Both the postcard and the agreement under the microscope lens, aligning the signatures side by side on the projection screen. The metallic click of the brass slide sounded sharp and decisive. I rotated the focus wheel, adjusting the contrast. On the wall, the two signatures of Arthur Vance appeared gigantically magnified. I activated the overlay function on the projector. Lines of the signature on the agreement slid over the faded ink of the postcard. They matched with absolute microscopic precision, every loop and tremor overlapping perfectly. Rise and fractures over decades, creating a unique pattern of microcracks, much like a human fingerprint, I explained, pointing to the screen. The cracks in the blue lines on this agreement, the ancient fissures on the postcard with 100% precision. It is impossible for a human hand to write an identical signature twice, let alone replicate 30-year-old microcracks. The signature was traced directly from this childhood card. The gigantic black lines on the screen stood as undeniable proof. A heavy, static-charged silence filled the courtroom, of ozone and exposed deceit. I picked up the fragile postcard, the dry paper rustling in my hand. Inhaling its musty scent, I began to read Arthur's faded handwriting aloud, trembling with controlled emotion. "My dear son, remember this. The most precious legacy a man can leave behind is a clean conscience. Books will teach you intelligence, but only your heart teach you honor. I believe you will grow into an honest man, a son who will make me proud." The words of the deceased father seemed to fill the room, invoking a ghost of truth. The beat of his father's voice shattered Charles's composure. A sharp scrape of wood echoed through the room as his chair slid away. Charles tried to stand, but his knees buckled. He collapsed into his seat once more, covering his face with his manicured hands, tears flowing through his fingers. His cynical defense crumbled under the weight of his own betrayal. Pulled away from him, his face twisted in panic, while Mr. Stern slowly lowered his pen, realizing their case was lost. The scent of Charles's expensive cologne was drowned out, a bitter atmosphere of public shame and regret. Judge Harrison's expression was of pure disgust. He raised his heavy wooden gavel and slammed it down with a thunderous crash. "The suit is dismissed with prejudice," he boomed. "Every freeze on the assets of Mrs. Helen Vance is dissolved. I am forwarding these documents to the state prosecutor for immediate investigation of forgery and grand larceny." The courtroom erupted into cheers. Thomas Blake embraced me, but I merely breathed a long, quiet sigh. the heavy weight of the last 3 years from my shoulders. Evening brought a profound peace to the legacy bookshop. The winter storm had passed, leaving Woodstock under a silent blanket of snow. I raked the embers in the old iron stove, adding thick pine logs that hissed and crackled, filling the room with warm, resinous heat. The copper kettle bubbled on the stovetop. The shelves were empty, but tomorrow the townspeople turned the crates, and the smell of old leather and vanilla paper would fill the sanctuary once again. I touched the empty oak shelves, my hand absorbing only the dry warmth of the stove. A cup of black tea, dropping a slice of lemon into the dark liquid. I sat in Arthur's old armchair, the worn leather welcoming my tired frame. Opening the restored volume of Frost's poems, golden glow of the lamp, I breathed in the scent of aged paper and fresh pine smoke. The long nightmare was over, and justice had returned to our quiet valley. I smiled into the warm room, realizing some things can never be stolen. A forgery always smells of cheap glue, but the truth, like a good book, only becomes more valuable with time.